As an introduction, I labeled this Follow the Science. And so this is going to be a little bit on evolution, but I'm not going to sit here and drill you through all the fossil record of evolution. I'm going to mention it real quickly, but I'm going to assume this is an old battle. This is a battle we fought when I was young. All the people with really gray hair you see in here, this was our global warming, like you see. And we fought this. We fought it tooth and nail as Christians. And we actually won the fight. But we got the exact same response. Follow the science and then ignore it completely. They claim the victory, having not won it, and then they demand that you never challenge it. And so I actually think, I'm not really knowledgeable on homeschooling, but I think homeschooling really started during this, when the world was filling our children's head with science rather than God, and many parents objected to that. And so it's not at all surprising here, 30, 40 years later, they're playing the exact same game with global warming, with masks. It's follow the science, and you're too dumb. We have to tell you what the science says. And they are absolute hacks at science. We have quite a few people in here that have engineering degrees or very technical degrees, and we're more than capable of reading their documents and understanding what they say. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you a little heads up into what actually occurred during that period of time, and then I'm gonna look at the statements the losing scientists made as they fell to their knees because Christians had taken them down. So this is gonna be fun, because now they've forgotten they said all that, and now they just have the victory of evolution, which, by the way, I'm a big sci-fi guy, and I watch everything I can, including the History channels and you know, any aliens of anything, you know. And you can't help but notice they can't skip a beat by not telling you the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And you know that they start there. That's the starting ground, and it's also not true. Okay, so what is it all about? It's not about the science, it's about the silence. They're trying to silence you. And you, meaning the people who run this country and work at it and are busy running your lives, but you're not the head curator at the Museum of Natural History, or you're not teaching paleontology at Harvard. That's their folks that are doing that. And so they considered a fait accompli. The debates dropped. And I want to give credit to one group did a great job, the Creation Research Institute. And I'm guessing all the folks that do home study know this group, right? You get a lot of the documents and detail from them. Henry Morrison and Dwayne Gish and a bunch of people like that wrote bookshelves full of books explaining how evolution cannot have worked. And why is evolution so important? It's important. Let me get it right here. Evolution's important because there's only two possible reasons for a living organism to be on this planet. And one is that a creator put it here. Something greater than us put it here, or it just happened all by itself. And this is the just happened all by itself crowd. And it is so absurd that it happened all by itself that they have to just use all these tactics. And they don't work. But the Creation Research Institute brought these people to their knees. There was a day they would not debate Dwayne Gish over fossils. He's a super knowledgeable fossil guy. He's been gone a long time now. But they used to debate him in live debates, and they just turned the debates down over the last, maybe from the 70s to the 90s. They just quit doing debates because he beat them in everything. So it was interesting. So why is it important that we study this? Because we all know creation, not evolution. Well, for a while, this started getting into the church. When I was a young Christian, there were churches, and there were people in the church that would say, well, it's theistic evolution. God created the beginning of it, and then evolution did the rest. That's a heresy. That's not what God said. If that's the way we got here, then the book of Genesis is a lie. And so people were willing to consider a heresy if it found peace between us and the science. And we can't accept that. And we're not going to be able to accept global warming and permanent masks either. We're not going to be able to survive as a society doing those things. All right, so they're going to fill up the universities and fill up these positions, but I'm going to give you an example of how the last battle ended. And I want us to use that as confirmation that we're not going to give up on this fight we're in either. All right, so my Bible verse, the first slide, is 2 Peter 3, 2 through 7. It says, that you should remember the predictions of the holy prophets and the commandments of the Lord and Savior through your apostles. Knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing. Scoffers are going to come with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where's the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. They're basically saying the flood never happened. That's what he's talking about. For they deliberately overlook the fact that the heavens existed long ago, the earth was formed out of water, and through water and the word of God, and by that means of these, the world was then existed, was deluged with water and perished. By the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. So I use this verse because Peter is showing you that it was not unexpected that scoffers, people who want to debate and lie about the past, are going to come around, and we're going to have to defend against that. And why us? Well, Christ is truth, and we're his emissaries here. We are the apostles of this age. We're the ministers. We take this message out. We know the truth, and we have to take it out to the lost, because there's a lot of lost people that really do believe the world's going to be destroyed by global warming in the next 30 years. And it's interesting, man's ability to delude himself is well known. It's a well-known concept that psychologists have studied, and there's this one guy, Glenn Morton, has what he calls Morton's demon. And he took this from another psychologist who used this for a different reason. But he said, imagine, this is a mental game. Imagine there's a demon sitting at your foot. And every time somebody brings you information that you agree with, he opens the door and lets it in. And every time somebody brings you information you don't agree with, he slams the door. And so you only see what you believe. You only reinforce the lie you've been told. You only reinforce what you misunderstand. That is the great delusion. And as I say that, you think to yourself, all I got to do is, just not do that. Well, but huge parts of humanity do it. Matter of fact, I would argue that in some aspect of your life, you've done it. There are things that you don't want to accept, and it's very easy to deny the truth and shut that door, let the demon shut the door. And by doing this, you allow yourself delusion. You allow yourself to be fooled. You might do this about a job. You might do this about a friend. You might do this, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say, well, I thought he was a really good friend, and then he did this. And if you follow back, you can look at the person who was doing that stuff all along. They just deluded themselves that's what it was. All right, so now what I'm going to do is just take a minute to go through some of what evolution does show in the fossil record. Now, I know there are people that can fight evolution. I actually prefer to fight it at the biological level, using biology. It's much easier to defeat there, but we didn't have that knowledge back in these days. It's easy to defeat in cosmology, looking at the universe and what's out there. It's easy to defeat in many, many other scientific realms. But we're going to look at the fossil record. Why the fossil record? Because if true, and this is what the evolutionist believes, that each layer of dirt just came from dust, and it settled and settled and settled. And so if you've got 10 feet of dirt, that's 5,000 years of settling. And this actually does happen on the earth. I was amazed. I went to Jerusalem, and we're at the normal level of dirt, talking. And then they took us to Old Jerusalem. We went underground, and there were columns and pillars, and there was a marketplace under the ground, and they had excavated it from in the dirt, and you were 10 feet underground, but that was ground level 2,000 years ago. So this idea that deposition of soil does happen is not a mistake. It's just a mistake drawing the conclusion they drew from it. All right, so slide 2. This is Darwin. Now, Darwin's credited with bringing the concept of evolution to the forefront. He wasn't the first one that ever did it, but he made it easy to believe. He gave an idea in natural selection. He gave a mechanism that would allow people to believe it could just happen by itself. Because if it was chance, it couldn't, but if there was some mechanism occurring that would root out the good things, then it would work. Well, here's Darwin. He says the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must truly be enormous. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory. So what he's just said is, I proposed this theory about how things evolve. We know the geological record and the fossils don't support it at all, and he says, the explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. So what he's saying is that we don't have this proof, but if we understood what's in the dirt better, if we had more people digging and more evidence, this is what would come out. So guess what the world did? They launched all kinds of archaeologists. I mean, archaeology went nuts after this, and it's been 170 years, and we've dug up everything. And there are fossil records all over the place. And so Darwin was correct that we didn't have a good fossil record, and he was also correct in that this would be this would ultimately be the flaw if these intermediate fossils did not exist, then it's very difficult to see how evolution would exist. Let's see. All right, so just real quickly about the fossil record, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on the fossil record. What it is if you go down to the strata of the earth, if you go look at it, and you go in here in Georgetown, you go through an area where they cut through the tree, cut through the land, and you see these layers. You're driving out to New Mexico, you see those layers. Go to the Grand Canyon. You go all the way to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. At the very bottom, you're at the Precambrian level. That's the level where there's nothing alive anymore. I mean, that's how deep the Grand Canyon is. You saw it. It's a mile up. So it's a lot of dirt stacked up on top of each other. But if you go down to the very bottom, very early, in the earliest dirt, you'll find fish. Now, below that, you might find amoebas and things like that, but soft-celled creatures don't leave great fossils, so you tend to find worms and things like that. But they find those. You'll find insects down below that, but then you find fish. Now, the problem with fish is that while we may consider them to be a relatively simple creature, they have a spinal cord, they have a rib cage, they have a skull, they're a vertebrate, they have a vertebrae just like you do. So this is actually a very complex creature in the overall concept of having just happened by itself. So the animals below there did not have any bones at all. And this one, well, the first time you see him, he's got all the bones of a rib cage, a spinal cord, and his nervous system runs through the spinal cord. That's called a chordate. It runs through the cord, and that all happened like boom, there's nothing, and then there's that. And so if you go from fish, if you go from reptiles to mammals, reptiles will lay eggs, they're cold-blooded, mammals are warm-blooded. Now, we know that. Do you know how complicated warm-blooded is? If you're going to be warm-blooded, you got to eat a lot, because now you're generating energy all the time. When you're sleeping, when you're walking, when you're standing, you got to eat 4 times more than a reptile does. So a reptile is a fairly simple creature, and the next thing we see is mammals. Let's see, mammals solved cold-blooded. They solved not having to have external eggs. They solved, very ornate hands and feet, and fast leopards and elephants. I mean, it's crazy that these things just suddenly appear. And by the way, everything in nature suddenly appears. Whales suddenly appear. Dolphins suddenly appear. Sharks suddenly appear. Giraffes suddenly appear. Horses suddenly appear. And so what that says is what Darwin was afraid of is that his theory would mean nothing if these intermediates didn't exist, and they don't exist. All right. So that's kind of where the fossil record got us to. And you think it would be a slam dunk. You say, okay, we're done. But that's not what happened. And I'm not going to have a slide for everything I'm going to read. I'm just going to put a couple slides up. But this is, so natural science decides to double down. In the absence of the fossil record for immediate stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed, is our inability to even imagine the construct, function, and intermediaries in many cases might have. Now, this is a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. So there's about a handful of people you should know who they are from the evolutionist world. Stephen Jay Gould is one of them. He's a Harvard professor, paleontologist, one of the most prolific writers about evolution there was. And because he's from Harvard, he's very trustworthy, and because he's a paleontologist, he knows more than we do. Now, what he's saying here is not only are they missing, we can't even figure out what they would have had to look like to go from here to here. You know, our imaginations won't even get us there, which is a pretty big admission of a problem here. The missing links between all these creatures is so great that we can't figure out how you'd go. So the greatest mind jump you can imagine is, where'd the whale come from, right? Because he's got fins and he breathes air. So in the evolutionist, he had to go, animals had to crawl on land, and then one of them got tired of being on land and went back to the water. And then when he went back to the water, he somehow lost his legs and his feet, and then he just became really big and took a deep breath and went underwater. And they propose, does anybody know what they propose as the animal? The hippopotamus. Have you ever seen a hippo? It looks nothing like a whale, but he does like to spend a lot of time in the water. But it's the only mammal that spends that much time in the water, that they had picked him because they cannot imagine what it would take to be an almost whale. I mean, what does that look like? We have no idea. We can't even imagine it. All right, that was Stephen Jay Gould in 1980, so that's fairly recent. We'll put up the phylogenetic tree. This is a term most kids going through biology would learn, the phylogenetic tree. This is the tree that shows the phyla. Phyla is the word for different species. And what you see is there's a root, and it came from something, and as you go further up, they become a little bit more complex, and there's the mammal at the top. And this is kind of a cartoon image of one. But here is Stephen Jay Gould again. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists. It is the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary tree that adorns our textbooks have data at the tips and the nodes, but nothing in the middle. Okay, so this is the guy writing your textbook, and he says, we've told kids this, we put this together, but he says, the little black lines, that's all the missing data. So you have a starfish, and then you have a sea squirt, the fish, and the frog. Somehow they connect together, and we don't have any idea what they do. That is the state of evolution even today. There's just not much information here. By the way, you don't hear much about evolution because it became what's called a settled science. They don't want to have a conversation because they know people like me and you and a dozen other people can just take them to the ground with this information. So they just don't talk about it much. There's one area, and I think I'll cover it later, they still might talk about. Okay, next slide, fossilization. Now it's important to note, because this is really important to the whole process. How hard is it for a creature to die and make a fossil? Okay, so if you look at some of the places we dig up animals, it looks like they're everywhere. You can go in the Mojave Desert and find Mojave Desert. You can go in West Texas and find them. You can go in Africa and England, and you can go anywhere on Earth and dig down and start finding fossils. So it looks like they're pretty easy to make. But the reality is they're extraordinarily uncommon. And this is right out of the American Geosciences Institute. Fossilization on land is very uncommon. However, because most areas of the land are being eroded, unless there is a deposition, fossils cannot be preserved. So he's saying there's as much erosion going on where the land is getting lower, not stacking up. And he said it's really the river valleys is the only place we would see it. That's not what we see on Earth today. You can go out in the middle of You go in the middle of Utah, and you're not near an ocean anywhere, and you can dig down and find shellfish fossils. And you're 300, 400 miles from the ocean. All right. Second thing, the body is usually exposed to air and water and a lot of oxygen, so it decomposes rapidly. The animal is likely to be fossilized only if it is buried soon after it dies, and even then, it is likely to decompose because the water that seeps in is rich in oxygen. Okay, so it's important for us to know, we think of oxygen as a friend, right? You take a deep breath, oxygen. You know, when you burn your pool out or your spa or something like that, you know what you're throwing in there, don't you? It's oxidizer. It's oxygen. Oxygen eats living things. It erodes them. That's why it makes rust out of metal. That's why when something dies, it immediately begins to decay, and it starts stinking, and it's ugly, and it falls apart, and after a few days, there's nothing there but a puddle. And that's because of oxygen. Now it's interesting, we need oxygen to live, but if you stop breathing, oxygen will decompose your body in about 10 days, right? So oxygen. So what he's saying is if there's exposure to oxygen, there's not going to be a fossil. So why do we have so many fossils? Where did all these fossils come from, and why are they unpredictably in large numbers in our world? Okay, here's a great one, slide 5. Colin Patterson. Now I like this guy because he writes a journal for the British Museum of Natural History. So when you hear the word Museum of Natural History, what you're hearing, that place is dedicated to evolution. It is a building dedicated to the study of natural evolution. Colin Patterson is doing this at the British one. So of all the natural museums, which one do you think is the most famous? It's the British one, because they've been around collecting fossils longer than anybody else, and they had Charles Darwin, and this is the temple of the evolutionists, and this is one of their writers. The editor of Professional Journal of British Natural Museum of History responded to a question why he did not include any intermediate fossils in his book written in 1979. So a writer is now asking him, or a reporter is now asking him, we read your book, how come you don't have any intermediaries? Because that's the whole idea you got to have. And he says, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossils or living, I would have certainly included them. You know, I wrote a book on evolution and I don't have any proof for it. I would have included it if I had it. And yet, he mentions Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, who he's quoting here, and the American Museum people, so there's American Museum of Natural History in the US, are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I say, I lay it on the line. There's not one such fossil for which anyone could make a watertight argument. Okay? So what I'm showing you here is these scientists, after years and years of being beat, they're now throwing their hands up saying, there isn't any. And this only happened because Christians went after them with the truth. Now this guy's an astrophysicist, George Greenstein, not somebody I think is anywhere near as well known, but he's got a PhD from Stanford, and he's a professor of astronomy. He says, as we survey all the evidence, the thought insistently arises that some supernatural agency, or agent rather, must be involved. It is is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we've stumbled upon scientific evidence for the existence of a supreme being? Yes, it is. I mean, I'll go ahead and answer his question. Yes, it is. It's entirely possible that you're going to be faced with the truth. All right, Colin Patterson again, the guy over the London Natural Museum. One morning I awoke and something had happened in the night. And it struck me that I had been working on this stuff, evolution, for 20 years, and there was not one thing I knew about it. It's quite a shock to learn that that one can be misled for so long. either there's something wrong with me or there's something wrong with the theory of evolution. This is George Walden, professor at Harvard University. One has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of living organisms is impossible. The spontaneous generation of a living creature is impossible. This is known as the theory of biogenesis. It was done by Louis Pasteur, and it says living things only come from living things. Living things only come from other living things. No living thing comes from nothing. Let's see, just a couple more. I want to get this. There's Robert Jastrow. This guy, this is a well-known quote, so I know a lot of people who've known this. He's an astronomer, physicist, cosmologist, beginning of time, evolutionist, author of God and the Astronomer, NASA scientist, Columbia PhD. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. He pulls himself over that final rock, and he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. You see, he's crawling up this mountain of knowledge, and what has he got? He's got to where we are. God created the universe. My last slide on fossils. We're going to skip Colin. Okay, so I want to explain fossils. Here's the interesting thing. Had they been a little bit more honest, they would have admitted that those fossils that we see happened in one event, Noah's flood. That was the event. Remember what it said it took to form a fossil? You had to bury the animal almost alive instantly, remove all oxygen. That makes a fossil. And then pile dirt on top of it real fast, right? That's what happened in Noah's flood. That happened in the first 5 or 6 days. And it just kept happening. It kept happening. All the strata we see today is the compressed version of Noah's flood. You might see some other strata, but it's not going to be anywhere near the height of these. So why wouldn't there be intermediaries in there? Because they all died on one day. That was a snapshot in time of the animal kingdom at that moment of Noah. So maybe there wouldn't be any. So I would argue that if you look in the Noah flood fossil record, you're not going to see 10,000 years of evolution. You're going to see 1 month of carnage and death. That's all you're going to see. And many, many animals existed then. They don't exist now. The most well-known was the dinosaur, right? We don't have them anymore. If the evolution would accept the Noah flood, they could explain why there's no intermediaries there, but they still have to find the intermediaries someplace. The slow deposition over millions of years is completely wrong. And God locked us into who we are with our DNA and RNA. There have been people that say, well, given enough time, you can have a sudden increase of mutations, and our mutations would create these new creatures. In all the time we've had a study, there's been one mutation in the human genome that people have said is a good mutation. Sickle cell anemia. And what it does, it makes you so you cannot get malaria. That's really good, but you die before you get to 30. So that's their good mutation. There are no good mutations. We took chickens, we took insects, we took flies, and we mutated them back in the 50s for 10,000 generations. You know what we did? We killed them all off. Every population we started with, we killed it because you put too much mutation in an animal and it dies. It's called mutation murder. So evolution just doesn't work. So what my call to us here is we're being challenged again with fake science that isn't real, global warming. I don't want to offend anybody here, but I'm old enough to remember what it was like in Texas in 1960, which is a long, long time ago. It was just like this. There were hot days, there were cold days. It rained sometimes, didn't rain others. We had floods, we had droughts. And I saw it in California. And I said, I have yet to be anywhere that I've seen a different weather pattern than I've seen over my nearly 70 years on this earth. And I'm sure Sam feels the same way. And Mike, those of us who've been here a while can tell you that it might be a little different, maybe a degree or two, but over our 80 years, if anything, it's gotten better. Because when I was a kid, you went to Los Angeles to go to Disney World, and your eyes burned from all the smog and the pollution and all the work with catalytic converters. We cleaned that up, and LA doesn't have that anymore. Now Beijing does, but LA doesn't. So I'm telling you, the world's better than it was when I was a child, not worse. And so we've got to fight this. And why? Because Jesus is the truth, and we are his truth tellers. And so as the world is going crazy in this, you're going to have to engage that person at the grocery store. You're going to have to engage that friend you work with, or you should try to. And you should continue to sow the seeds of doubt in their mind, because over time, we, the truth sayers, can win this argument. And that, I think, is one of the main reasons we're here. We're here to help the lost find their way. And if they find their way, they put their hope in Jesus. And Jesus will protect us. And the Bible also says that God holds this world. He maintains it until he is going to destroy it. So you don't have to, if it's going to be destroyed in the next 30 years, it's a surprise, and it's not going to be anything you do.